Catherine Delahunty.
Tēnā koe, Mr.
Tēnā
Speaker.
koe.
He mihi nui ki te whare paramata ko tēnei pō. Isn't it great to be talking about something that really matters, even though everybody's claiming to be child-centric, whatever that is. Child-centric is not a very pretty word. I don't even know what it means. Sounds really odd, child-centric. But I think they mean, Mr. Speaker, children at the centre, but child-centric sounds very mechanistic. But of course, this is a very mechanistic bill. It's got all kinds of bizarre processes and ideas that nobody asked for. And I'd have to say, where does it come from? Where's the evidence of educational benefit to children, who they're supposed to be so centred on? Who asked for these changes? Who came and begged for more flexible hours for schools so that children could all finish at different times? Which schools came and said, oh, please, we need a super principal we need 3 or 4 schools under one principal? No one came and asked us that. No one came and said that was a brilliant idea either. All of these wonderful changes in this bill, which I would describe as a mishmash of dubious ideas, were not asked for by the education community or parents. But it was somebody's idea because it's, tomorrow's schools, they've had some very odd ideas. Ideologically consistent idea. Because if you think a principal is like a business manager, you know, sort of inspiring captain of the ship, distant figure with a sort of entrepreneurial gleam in their eye, gazing across the vista of a number of schools where they give the odd bit of inspirational guidance, that might be what this government imagines a super principal does. But a real principal, and we all talk to them, is up to their neck in multitasking and building relationships within their school every single day. There might be 1 or 2 rural schools who would benefit from this provision, but most of the schools actually need somebody who has that relationship with the students. And I think the member Jenny Salisa described one example of that very clearly. So it does seem like an odd provision, given that there is no outcry in the community for taking the idea of a principal who's intimately involved in a relationship with the students in their school and spreading them around into this. But I do think it is part of an ethos. If you see education as a business, then of course efficiency is a key value. And it's sometimes more efficient to do things with one leader over a number of modules, so we call them, or number of widgets, or a number of organisational blocks, because it's a business idea, much like the idea of getting people who aren't particularly well trained to come in as long as they've got a graduate degree and then say that they've got the pedagogy of education after 6 weeks. That is another idea of efficiency. It's pretty efficient because you don't want to waste your graduates. Some of them might be quite good at it. However, the values behind education are a lot more profound. And that is why we can't support the bill, because we looked through it and we thought, well, what can we support? There was a few good things happened at the Set Committee, a few improvements were made, but most of the time, as Chris Hipkins said, we couldn't get any of our questions answered about the practicality of some of these ideas. So we couldn't get that question answered about who would be the employer of the principal. We couldn't get the question answered about how you'd manage school transport when you had a complex family arrangement, probably already complex, and then the schools decided to make it even more complicated. We couldn't get questions answered about home care. It's a very, very contested space. Again, these provisions open up and facilitate the further development of a business. A fantastically lucrative, in some ways for some of the franchises, these businesses that haven't been properly reviewed, some of which do a great job and some of which don't, but none of which experience the kind of scrutiny or rigour that the kindergartens and the community-based education centres that are under scrutiny actually receive. But we did manage to improve some of this section because originally they were going to be allowed to have no more than 6 children, but they could have, 12 of their own. However, we managed to tighten up some very loose drafting there and make it a little bit safer. But we are concerned about home care. We're very concerned about the frozen review and what that actually means for children, because the government's goal in ECE is participation, not quality. participation, meet the target, 98%. Home care plays a big role, and it's not education, mainly it's home care, but in actually meeting the target, you know, from a business point of view, they've met the target, but we don't know whether the kids are safe or not, and that's not really acceptable. Other aspects of the bill were pretty interesting.
Keep the noise down.
The Teach First issue, you can debate its contribution to the secondary schools, but the NZDI made a submission in which they raised some concerns about primary schools. And when we asked the Teach First people who came as submitters, they didn't seem to know whether it was for primary or secondary or who it was for. We didn't have a whole lot of schools come and actually attest to their brilliance, and they didn't seem to know what the law said. But the law actually does say in this bill that it could possibly be primary schools as well. So what we're suggesting is that subject graduates in specialist subjects can now teach in primary school under this model, because the pedagogy of learning is not important. And that's what concerns me about this government's attitude towards the education system as a whole, is that the teaching pedagogy doesn't exist as a thing in their minds. What exists is ways of being innovative or ways of being flexible, but the core ideas about what it is that you need to be able to do, one needs to be able to do to understand how children learn, don't get much of a look in. So we don't get much discussion about children as learners. We get a lot of discussion about measuring, targets, flexibility, choice, efficiency, blah, 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 but we don't get much talk about how do different children learn, and particularly at the primary level, where it's not focused on subject, it's focused on child. A graduate might turn out to be the most brilliant teacher, or they might not have a clue how a child with dyslexia entering the school system actually learns, or how a child who's non-verbal, or a child who will become a capable learner but is relatively slow and doesn't meet the standard, how they operate in the complex new environment for that child. And we all know that early childhood and the early years of primary are the most important time in a child's life. So let's throw some untrained people at them and see what happens. Wouldn't that be a good idea? So we're particularly concerned about that. As for the charter schools being sponsored by the universities, I think Chris Hipkins is right. I think this relates to the disappointing patchy performance of the existing charter schools, and also the problem of getting new ones on board. So when there's a strong push to make this work, because the Act, national government agreement says we must have these schools, and then there's incidents that take place like Whangaruru, which was a disaster for those children, and it's the children, we should never forget, who suffered from what happened at Whangaruru. The evaluation of the first round of charter schools showed that this expensive model failed some children, and the only area in which they were innovative educationally was in governance, which is actually not particularly innovative. What it means is, again, they got rid of the parents, they got rid of the boards of trustees, and they have corporate sponsors who can be governance, unaccountable governors with no input from parents. So that's the big innovation in charter schools. But educational innovation is not about governance, it's about education. And that's where we're not seeing amazing educational pedagogical innovation in those schools. And if you look at the results, some of them are as good as other schools, some of them are worse, and it's not worth the money we're putting in, let alone trying to get the universities, who have a very interesting pedagogical model, but it's really not about people, young people who are unconventional, not neurotypical, different types of learners. It's actually about lecturing people and hoping they can go away and do their own research. That's not the model we want in primary school, let alone charters that aren't accountable. So we've got real concerns about some of those issues. I think that an education bill like this, a sort of dubious mishmash like this, could be improved by answering questions at the Select Committee, and that's what we didn't get. We couldn't get any answer to the question on flexible school hours. We couldn't get any answer on the employment of principals. We couldn't get any clarity, and what we did get was an SOP that was forced upon us, and then we had to go into a rearguard action and force more debate. So really, it's been a mess, and it's still a mess. Thanks, Mr Speaker.
Tracy Martin.